after over 50 years on the road, Bob Seger said last year he was hanging it up. Will he? I think so. Oh, we might catch him around once in a while. But crossing the country, keeping the rock rolling on stage night after night is over, I think, and he can now take a well-deserved rest. I was fortunate enough to see Bob Seger live in 1976. This was right after the Live Bullet album came out. He opened a show for Kiss in St. Louis. I'll try and give you a little insight on that later on in the video. With a career spanning 6 decades, Bob has sold more than 75 million records worldwide, making him one of the world's best-selling artists of all time. Bob was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004, and just as important, in my opinion, the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2012. So let's take a few minutes and look back on his life and career, how he got his start, why he decided to retire, and we'll make a few stops in between also. Real quick, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Now, on to Bob Seger. He was born Robert Clark Seger, May 6, 1945, at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. His father's name was Stuart and his mother's was Charlotte. He had one brother named George. His father led a 13-piece orchestra on weekends in the 1940s. He encouraged a preschool-aged Bob to learn to play the ukulele, but sadly, his father abandoned the family, leaving his wife and kids to fend for themselves when Bob was just 10 years old. Bob was raised in the Detroit, Michigan suburb of Dearborn until age 5, when his family moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. By the time Bob had reached high school, he was playing the electric guitar and keyboards pretty good. He honed his musical skills in high school by performing at local parties in Ann Arbor in a 3-piece band called the Decibels. Later, he was a member of bands called the Town Criers and the Omens. Some of Bob's early influences included country music and rhythm and blues artists, especially Wilson Pickett, Solomon Burke, Van Morrison, Otis Redding, James Brown, and Detroit's own Mitch Ryder. In 1964, at the age of 19, Bob formed the band Last Heard with the organ player from Del Shannon's band. They recorded the singles The Lonely One and East Side Story. Now, East Side Story caught the ear of a Detroit club owner named Ed Punch Andrews, who owned Hideout Records. By 1965, Andrews and Seger had raised enough money to release East Side Story, which sold 50,000 copies in the Detroit area. The pair became partners and shared a solid business relationship that endured for over 3 decades. In 1966, Bob recorded the single Heavy Music on the National Cameo Parkway label, selling 66,000 copies. Heavy Music nearly reached the top 100 charts in 1967. In 1968, Seger assembled the Bob Seger System and released his debut album, Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, on Capitol Records. On the recording of Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, Glenn Frey, one of the founding members of the Eagles, is one of the backup singers. Him and Bob had become good friends when Bob was 19 and Glenn 16. Bob says his manager, who I assume was Punch Andrews at the time, owned a few clubs around the area, had heard Glenn, and wanted to manage him. He goes on to say that they would visit back and forth to each other's houses and listen to records and talk music. Bob laughs that Glenn's mom always called him Bobby. He goes on to say he kind of produced a song for Glenn when he was with the group called the Mushrooms. He says he really didn't do much, as they just played the song and he turned the dials. But anyhow, Glenn had introduced Bob to these girls who sang, and Bob asked them to come down to the studio and help record this song with him. It was done on 4 tracks, with Glenn and the girls singing backup vocals and percussion on one track, Bob on another, and the band split the other two between the bass and drums and guitar and organ on the other. So if you want to check something out on the 1966 recording of Ramblin' Gamblin' Man, Bob says, listen to the very first chorus and the backup singers coming in. He says Glenn comes in and just powers on the word man, on the lyrics, Ramblin' Man. He toned it down the rest of the song, but if you listen to the song, pay attention, and you can hear exactly what he is talking about. There wasn't many do-overs or the money to do them for something like this in 1966. Glenn Frey says that the best lesson he ever got in music came from Bob Seger. If you want to make it in this business, you need to start writing your own songs, Bob told him. Glenn said, but the songs I write suck. Bob told him, they will suck, but you keep doing it and they will get better. Many years later, Bob and Glenn, along with Don Henley and J.D. Souther, would team up to write the song Heartache Tonight. It reached #1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100 in November in 1979 and was certified platinum by the Record Industry Association of America, representing 1 million copies sold. It was the Eagles' final chart-topping song on the Hot 100. A lot of musicians have a lot of good things to say about Bob Seger. He helped quite a few along the way. Although Bob admits he only came up with the hook, line, and chorus to Heartache Tonight, it doesn't take away from the fact that Bob wrote many songs throughout his career and was well deserving of that 2012 induction in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Just check out his albums and look at how many of those hits he wrote. During the late 60s and early 70s, Bob kept recording and playing out on the road, working as many as 250 gigs a year. And he kept writing. Many of Bob's songs were heartfelt around this time, including the song Turn the Page. It sure fits what they were going through. They gained a little traction in the heartland of America, but still couldn't bust it open nationwide. But that was soon to come. Although he says the song wasn't written about himself, it sure seemed to fit the way he had been feeling when he penned Beautiful Loser. The album was released in April 1975. This was his 8th studio album and was recorded in Muscle Shoals using their studio musicians for the most part, with the exception of a few songs where the Silver Bullet Band came in. After this album was released, Bob and the Silver Bullet Band was to record a live album. It was taken from 2 shows at Cobo Hall in Detroit in November of 1975. I can't say honestly if there was or was not any overdubbing. My guess would be probably, as it happens on most all live albums. It was recorded in November and wasn't released until April of 1976, so it seems they took their sweet time getting this album ready. But no matter what, this album came out and gained Bob and the band a little more traction, but they were still not known nationwide. That would come on his next album, Night Moves. It blew the doors off. I want to stop here, as in April of 1976, Live Bullet was released, and Night Moves in October of 1976. In between that time, I got to see Bob Seger live. It was in July of 1976 I saw him. He was the opening act for Kiss. I had Seger's Beautiful Loser album, and I enjoyed it. But right before this concert, the local St. Louis radio station, KSHE, started playing cuts from the Seger Live Bullet album. And I was thinking, man, these guys really sound good. So I thought it should be a good show. It was at Kiel Auditorium, downtown St. Louis. I had got tickets early, so we had main floor about 20 rows back, right in the center. The auditorium, I believe the seating capacity is around 10,000, and it was totally full. Kiss was really big around the area, and many were there in their Kiss makeup. But anyhow, when Seger opened up, the energy coming off the stage was amazing. It seemed to me from the first number, which, if memory serves me correct, was Nutbush City Limits, people, mainly the girls, were up and dancing in their seats and out in the aisles. People were standing up and just rocking to this guy. He had them from the first song and held them to the very end. He had to come back and do an encore, which I believe was Kathmandu, and the place went totally nuts. They finally left the stage and brought the house lights up a little, and still the people wouldn't settle down, just screaming and clapping for this guy and his band. It must have took them 10 to 15 minutes to really settle down. I knew from that time on Bob Seger was going to be great. There was no denying him. And right after that Night Moves album came out, as they say, the rest is history. One piece of history I think any Bob Seger fan should know is how the song Old Time Rock and Roll came to be. This song was demoed down at Muscle Shoals Sound Studio using the Swampers and was written by a rhythm and blues singer and songwriter named George Jackson. If you're really interested in how fate works in the music business, I'm just going to give you a link to an interview with these guys that took place back in 2008. Jimmy Johnson, who does most of the talking, passed away a few years back, along with Roger Hawkins last year, I think. David Hood, last I heard, is still going strong at 78. But they can tell this story better than I ever could because they were there, and this interview is great. I had read the story in a magazine some years back, and while looking around for it online, I came up with this video. I'll put a link in the description box for any of you all who likes rock history. This is a great story and one you should enjoy. Now to the question, why did Bob Seger retire and will he ever tour again? As I said in the beginning, I don't think so. We have to remember, Bob's 77 now. He's been going at it since the 60s. That is a long time. But I think the real reason is he feels it's time and he wants to be free. After losing his longtime friend and bandmate, sax player Alto Reed, and then his brother George a few months later, that will make you sit up and take notice that we only have so much time here. It was right after Alto and his brother's death that Bob made the decision to retire. It is time for him to kick back and enjoy some beach time in Florida, I think. You never know. We may see him out again on tour, but I kind of believe that he's just going to enjoy some life now. Bob Seger will always be remembered for his gravelly rock and roll voice and the great bands he had behind him. But remember, so many of them hits we all like, Bob wrote himself. As good of a vocalist as he was, I think he might have been an even better songwriter. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please give it a like and share it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I'd appreciate it. Lots of videos here to watch. Some good, some not so good. Watch them all. See if you can tell the difference. Catch y'all later.